Chernobyl is the second major single explosion that had exposed the public to major doses of radiation. This explosion is considered a human-induced disaster, and this presentation will examine the factors that affected the choice of adjustments before and responses to the disaster. On the evening of April 26, 1986, the operating crew planned to test Unit 4's turbines if they could produce enough energy to keep the coolant pumps running in case of external power loss. However, Chernobyl's Unit 4 nuclear power station released a sudden surge of power that melted fuel rods, ignited the graphite covering, and released a cloud of radiation. In an effort to limit the damage from a potential disaster, several adjustments prior to the event were implemented. Firstly, there was an emergency core cooling system that included the pumping of more water to cool the nuclear rods, the emergence of nuclear rods, and the submerging of control rods that absorbs neutrons. In addition, in the cooling process, there were 4 cooling pumps, one of which was always on standby just in case of any emergency. There was also a 24-hour emergency firefighting crew that was on standby. Factors that affected these adjustments include hazard type. The fact that the disaster occurs randomly with a rapid speed of onset requires that there be a monitor to regulate the plant's activities at all times. In addition, because the hazard is human-induced, emergency systems were built to prevent an explosion from occurring. There were 2 major political factors that affected the minimal adjustments. Firstly, the culture of secrecy was prevalent in communist society. It led to the segregation of knowledge, which prohibited people from seeing the big picture to integrate all aspects of safety for the operation. Secondly, during the Cold War, the plutonium production aspect of the RBMK reactor imposed a sense of urgency on their design, construction, and operation because the Cold War was an arms race. No time was to be wasted on improvements that are essential to safe operation. The scientists and engineers worked under one and only one guideline: to produce weapons-grade plutonium as much and as quickly as possible. Economically, budgetary problems tied into the political factors because the Cold War obligated the Russians to invest on their army. The funds that were available were used to produce the maximum amount of the highest quality weapons-grade plutonium-239 as quickly as possible. This meant that less money was used to focus on implementing safety measures to the power plant. Socially, because nuclear power was relatively new at that time, people were not fully aware of its precautions. The lack of knowledge plays a contribution to why minimal adjustments were made to reduce vulnerability. For example, the JITI Project Institute, which oversaw the design of the plant, and the Soyuzatomenergo, the Ministry of Energy department responsible for plant personnel and activities, were headed by directors who had never been trained in nuclear physics or complexities of nuclear power plants. Moreover, the government was not fully aware of the consequences of nuclear power and did not think through procedures in case of emergencies. As a consequence, because this was a top-down system, the public were not thoroughly educated and informed about nuclear information and how to prepare for a hazard event. It is clear that the explosion of the Chernobyl reactor was made possible by the many shortcomings of the Soviet system. One may well say that Chernobyl explosion was more of a Soviet event than a nuclear event. After the hazard event, several responses were made in the short-term, mid-term, and long-term. Short-term responses are responses that take place only a few hours or even a few days after the hazard event. When reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, the facility burst into flames. The first response was taken immediately after the explosion by the 24 standby firefighting crew of Chernobyl. This response was local because of the secrecy in the Soviet Union. Midterm responses are responses that take place within a few days to a few weeks after the hazard event. Nationally, 3 days after the event, the whole population of Pripyat and other surrounding areas were ordered to evacuate the area, displacing 110,000 people. Although there were firefighters on the scene to extinguish the flame, the radiation of the burned reactor was still very hot and radiating heat. To stop this, military personnel and helicopters covered the reactor with sand and led to ensure the radiation would not continue to seep into the air. This, however, only made the situation worse and increased the temperature of the reactors. Another national midterm response are liquidators. which is a term used for the men and women who served in the cleanup of Chernobyl. Miners were one such instance of liquidators. Miners from Tula were called to help dig a tunnel 30 meters long directly under the nuclear power plant, then dig a room 30 meters long and wide to hold a refrigerator device to cool the reactor. Internationally, a press conference in Moscow was held with the International Atomic Energy Association IAEA, which called for a post-accident analysis to see the extent of the damage caused and to see how the international community can help the Russians recover. Long-term responses are responses that take place within a few weeks to years after the disaster. To prevent the radiation from further spreading into the atmosphere, reactor number 4 was covered in a sarcophagus which prevented the radiation from being exposed to nature. Moreover, an exclusion zone of 2,600 kilometers squared was created to protect people from the harmful effects of radiation. Lastly, iodine pills are still being given to children to prevent thyroid cancer. The number of cases of thyroid cancer is the only type of cancer that has seen an increase, and many speculate it is due to nuclear fallout. One of the factors that affected the response to the disaster was the magnitude of the event. The hazard was considered a level 7, which is a major disaster event on the IAEA's International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale in S. Because of the high magnitude, there were international involvements to mitigate the consequences of the hazard event. The need for responses also led to the opening up of the Soviet Union. Another factor that affected the response was the predictability of the event. Because it was unpredictable and random, the responses were slow and there were little preparations. This was one of the reasons why there were only firefighters present directly after the explosion. A political factor that affected the responses was, again, the fact that the government wanted to keep things hidden from others outside the Soviet Union. Because this was the case, there was only minimal coverage of the situation from the media. The USSR not only failed to inform its own citizens about the seriousness of the accident, but also failed to provide prompt warning to its foreign neighbors. There was an absence of emergency communication plan and a deliberate withholding of data on radiation releases. This was one of the major factors that affected the failure to respond rapidly and effectively after the hazard event. Another factor that affected the responses was the perceived level of risk. There was a lack of knowledge and experience of what to do when a nuclear explosion occurs, which decreases the perception of risk. This decrease in perception of risk leads to a lack of immediate responses to the disaster. This ties into the level of development in the USSR at that time. Because the USSR was generally poor, there was lack of investment on resources to effectively respond to the hazard event. Moreover, the level of education for Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia was generally low, which contributes to the perceived level of risk because people were not educated on how to deal with the events of a nuclear disaster. In conclusion, one of the major factors that affected the adjustments and responses to the disaster was the government control. The Chernobyl explosion was one of the leading contributing factors that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. This event forced the USSR to open up to and participate in international affairs, which exposed the turmoil within the society. In addition, because Chernobyl was the first major nuclear disaster, it served as a basis for how the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011 should react and respond.